can't be done overnight.
Well, Dr. Randolph Kent is the director of the Humanitarian Futures Programme at King's College London. He's with me now. It's the time, I suppose, 5 weeks on, to start thinking about the lessons that need to be learned from the way all the aid has been handled into Haiti.
I think you're so very right. There are some very fundamental lessons we have to learn. We have to learn that the humanitarian crises that we'll have to face in the future will have to be handled by a far wider range of actors than the community that we rely on now. For example, we have to engage more effectively with the military. We have to see and bring in the corporate sector more effectively. And we have to take a look at the United Nations and have the United Nations really deal with the kinds of anticipation and innovation that will be needed to deal with crises.
Well, that's an interesting point. You know, you mentioned the military there. We saw an American soldier. The Americans have been heavily in the Asian tsunami. We often seem to turn to the American military because it's big. It suggested, though, one lesson that could be learned is perhaps the UN should have some sort of standing military force that could be used in this sort of scenario.
I think the United Nations role should be far more to warn the wider international community of the kinds of long-term threats that we will have to face. I think another very fundamental role for the United Nations will be to become an advocate, to mobilize the wider humanitarian sector. And that will have to include the military as well as the corporate sector and the traditional humanitarian arm to engage in joint preparation for dealing with the kinds of futures we will have to face in the future. So with that in mind, the United Nations also has to be an advocate. And the United Nations also has to serve as an innovator. You know, the Humanitarian Futures Program that I represent is doing more and more work trying to bring scientists and humanitarian policy makers together. We are trying to do this on our level, but this should be a global initiative that the United Nations takes charge of.
Do you think we learn from disaster? I asked that question because I was a BBC correspondent at the Asian tsunami. Then we had all the talk about lack of coordination in the early days between agencies. We've had it again over Haiti. Yeah. It does seem as though the learning process is rather slow.
I think in a sense the learning process is slow. And here, if we really look to the future of our children and our children's children, what will be essential is to say that the way we used to do things and the continuing mistakes of the 20th century really have to change in the 21st century, that there has to be different forms of collaboration, different ways of looking at innovation and prioritizing innovation and anticipating the types of crises and the different types of crises that we'll have to face in the future.
All right, so all very interesting. Dr. Randolph Kent, thank you very much for joining us today.